On January 7th, the Environmental Protection Agency released its report on the alleged health effects of environmental tobacco smoke.
The report stands as an example of EPA's commitment to public involvement and its commitment to good science.
But that isn't necessarily the case when it comes to science and the Environmental Protection Agency. Its recent report on the alleged health risks of environmental tobacco smoke, ETS, is just the most recent example of the agency's use of controversial science and questionable methodology.
I've published a number of papers in this area, specifically environmental tobacco smoke and lung cancer. And like many of the other papers in this field, I come to different conclusions from the EPA so I do not accept that environmental tobacco smoke is a cause of lung cancer.
My reaction to the EPA report is that I'm disappointed. I could be angry as a scientist, but I guess I'm more disappointed because it's representative of poor science. And one would want to believe that an agency with people that they pick to review this would produce a report that's scientifically based. I don't think it is.
In the past, you have been skeptical of what we have had to say about environmental tobacco smoke. My only hope today is that you apply perhaps 10% of the skepticism you would reserve for me for the EPA. If you go just that far, if your skepticism could take you just a few steps beyond reporting this as, quote, EPA reported and the tobacco industry said, unquote, then I'm confident that you will conclude that what the EPA wants you to see is not nearly what the science supports. What the EPA wants you to see is a risk assessment that no one but tobacco interests will challenge, because it's about tobacco. And it seems virtually everyone is willing to believe virtually anything negative about tobacco without scrutiny. Let's be very clear here. The risk assessment is based on such a fragile house of cards that if it dealt with anything other than tobacco, many of you would have already ripped it apart and the EPA bureaucracy would have buried it in embarrassment.
This is not the first time the EPA's findings have been disputed. The agency has a history of controversial scientific findings. In 1982, the Environmental Protection Agency ordered the permanent evacuation of the town of Times Beach, Missouri, when the agency found high levels of dioxin in the community. At the time, some of the EPA's own scientists found research that conflicted with the agency's findings. But the EPA went ahead with the evacuation. After nearly a decade of controversy and research that proved dioxin to be far less toxic than previously believed, the EPA finally agreed to reevaluate its dioxin standards. That wasn't an isolated case. Several years ago, the EPA reported that alar, a chemical used in apple growing, caused cancer in laboratory rats. Although some evidence indicated the cancer risk to humans from alar was extremely slight, the EPA instituted a ban on alar. However, subsequent research supports what many scientists had thought all along, that alar may be less harmful than previously thought. Recently, at a symposium on environmental challenges facing the 103rd Congress, Lori Wesley from the National School Board Association raised the issue of asbestos in schools.
In 1990, then EPA Administrator William Riley came close to admitting that the organization was responsible for a significant environmental mistake. In a speech before the American Enterprise Institute, Riley admitted that much of EPA's work on the asbestos issue was at best riddled with errors and had been a very expensive blunder. Billions and billions of dollars have been spent, both in schools and in public buildings. Schools have spent dozens of billions of dollars removing asbestos or managing it. And every one of those dollars was taken from the scarce educational resources that this country needs to build the world-class schools that it says it wants.
In fact, former EPA Administrator William K. Riley was so concerned over questions about the agency's use of science that he demanded an audit to examine the way EPA uses science and the way they determine policy. The report, released in 1992, was extremely critical of the agency in many key areas, finding that currently EPA science is of uneven quality, and the agency's policies and regulations are frequently perceived as lacking a strong scientific foundation. In the absence of sound scientific information, it is likely that high-profile but low-risk problems will be targeted, while more significant threats are ignored. EPA science is perceived by many people, both inside and outside the agency, to be adjusted to fit policy. Scientists at all levels throughout EPA believe that the agency does not use their science effectively. EPA should be a source of unbiased scientific information. However, EPA has not always ensured that contrasting, reputable scientific views are well explored and well documented from the beginning to the end of the regulatory process. In addition, the agency is perceived to have a conflict of interest because it needs science to support its legal activities. That's what many scientists have accused the EPA of doing with its report on environmental tobacco smoke. In this case, the EPA did no clinical or laboratory research. The agency based its risk assessment calculations on a review of 30 epidemiological studies conducted in the 1980s. 24 or 80% of them failed to support EPA's conclusion. In fact, the same methodology applied to these epidemiological studies would find that drinking chlorinated water produces twice as many cancer deaths than the lung cancer deaths EPA claims are associated with environmental tobacco smoke.
One of the largest and most recent studies on environmental tobacco smoke was recently published in the American Journal of Public Health, November 1992. That study was conducted with funding from the National Cancer Institute. It was not supported in any way by any tobacco company. That NCI study reported no overall statistically significant association between ETS and lung cancer. That National Cancer Institute study is not even included in the EPA risk assessment. If the data from that study were included in the EPA risk assessment, the overall lung cancer risk estimates from ETS exposure would not be statistically significant. Fact: of the 11 U.S. studies on which the EPA relative risk calculation was based, not one originally reported an overall statistically significant risk. It was only after the EPA changed the rules and went back and lowered the statistical standard used by the study's own authors that EPA was able to force the conclusion of increased risk.
Those are the undeniable facts. That is, they changed the statistics from the norms that is normally used, and they ignored data. Those are the facts. Now I ask you, if those are the facts, which they are, why did the EPA have to do that? If the evidence is so strong on environmental tobacco smoke, why did they have to change?
First of all, we have to realize that EPA itself has reached the conclusion about ETS by bending their own rules of evidence, so to speak. And therefore, this is an element of danger, simply from a procedural point of view. The other danger, of course, is that they might use the same unscientific approach. I hesitate to use the word arrogant approach, but in essence it is an arrogant approach based on the statutory authority that these agencies have, by which they have come to feel free to say almost anything they want.
Since the release of its report on environmental tobacco smoke, many scientists, journalists, and even the general public are taking a fresh look at the EPA's record and asking whether the agency's actions were motivated by science or politics.
I think that the document, although it's represented as being a careful evaluation of the scientific data available on this issue, in fact, it's essentially a policy-oriented document, and its real design is to provide justification for government regulation of smoking in workplaces and in other places.
Serious questions remain concerning the EPA's methodology and conclusions. Philip Morris believes that the EPA's designation is not justified by the available science. Philip Morris supports the accommodation of both smokers and non-smokers in public places. We urge others to review all options concerning smoking in public places and to make a decision that addresses their specific needs. When all of the facts about ETS are in, Philip Morris believes that smokers and non-smokers will learn to coexist amicably through common sense, courtesy, and mutual accommodation.